Hi, I'm Clarissa Foco, and this is Over the Top, Under the Radar. Each week, we take a look at the news agenda to identify stories that are being over-reported and the ones that are going under the radar and not being talked about enough. Today's episode is an in-depth look at the rise of the far right in conversation with Joe Mulhall from Hope Not Hate. You might remember Joe was on the show last year in the wake of the Southport riots. It can be a bit of a full-on listen, and I want to acknowledge for some of us it's really hard to be thinking about the rise of the far right, racists out on the streets, emboldened, and something that I think has been missing from a lot of mainstream media coverage is an acknowledgement that the prevalence and visibility of racists and fascists, it makes a lot of us feel a lot less safe. But I think it's an important issue that we need to understand. So hopefully it will be an interesting listen. And we've got a few notes of optimism in there at the end. Hi, Joe. Welcome back.
Hi, good to see you again.
How's the last year been?
Yeah, difficult and busy, but I think, we've got there before, so I'm sure we'll get there again.
There are sort of two things I really wanted to talk to you about. And the first is Tommy Robinson's Unite the Kingdom rally, which I think when everyone's listening to this will have been just over 2 weeks ago. I re-listened to our conversation from last year, and you talked about Tommy Robinson having a rally of 20 or 30,000 people not so long ago. It looks like this demo was a lot bigger. The official numbers seem to be between 100 and 150,000. What's the story behind the rally? How did he manage to mobilize so many people?
Yeah, I mean, it was really quite scary, actually. So, I mean, he claimed 3 million people. It was obviously nowhere near that.
I saw that. That was I've got a question about that later.
It was nowhere near that, but it could have comfortably been 150,000 people, which by some margin will be the largest ever far right protest we've ever seen in Britain. I think back to the English Defence League days where my job for Hope Not Hate was attending EDL rallies to see what was going on. And they were 3,000 or 4,000 people at their largest, and we think about the importance that that movement had in terms of scaring lots of people in this country. This is obviously just significantly larger. What was especially worrying, actually, I think, is that why the EDL days, they were smaller but much more violent, or in many ways more violent. The rhetoric, in some ways, what we saw in London was actually more extreme this time around. The EDL was extremely Islamophobic, really anti-Muslim. This was a wider set of issues being discussed around multiculturalism having failed, the calling for banning of non-Christian religions and religion symbolism, the banning of places of worship that aren't Christian, talk about being invaded, about remigration, ostensibly the removal of people of colour and the likes from different communities. So the rhetoric was actually in some ways more extreme than it would have been in the EDL days. But the numbers were 150,000 people. So that's what made it really worrying. And I think it also showed that Tommy Robinson is, as he has been for a long time, is a real central figure in the international networks within global far-right networks. We had figures from around the world. We had Americans, we had people from Holland, Belgium, Poland, just loads of France. We had Zemmour, of course, who's to the right of Le Pen.
Yeah, I was struck by that. Is that a new phenomenon? It feels like the far right are incredibly good at solidarity and building connections internationally. Is that new, or has that always been a feature of the movement?
I think what's changed is the far right and back into the 20s and 30s, fascist movements had national organisations which collaborated. They would have conferences and they'd have meetings and those sorts of things. They've always done that sort of thing. And there's always been that contradiction, extreme nationalist or ultra-nationalist groupings collaborating across borders. And that's always created tensions. I think what's changing now in the age of the internet is that we have increasing networks of activists that conceptualise their struggle internationally. So they might care about hyper-local issues down their street or in their community, but they're connecting all these dots internationally. So they're not just getting angry about halal chicken nuggets being sold at a school in Blackburn, they're also being angry about the same thing happening in Warsaw or Sydney or Toronto. And they're talking about essentially the West being under attack. And I think a lot of that is coming out of these anti-Muslim movements after 9/11, but they really are international in the way that they consider this now. They talked about the West and they talked about Europe being under threat and being abolished and being replaced. These conspiracy theories about Muslims replacing essentially white British people.
Before we dive into what happened at the rally, I think it's one thing that I found a bit frustrating about the media coverage, and I'd love to hear your perspective, is it seems to be there's a lot of hand-wringing and reluctance to call this a far-right rally or a racist rally. I've heard a few people say, well, people on the march weren't racist. I'd love your perspective. You're an expert on the far right and whether it was a far right rally. Tommy Robinson has been a figure in British politics for decades now. And it almost strikes me as a bit patronising to say completely fair to say that people on the rally might have concerns about the economy and other things, but this was billed as a far-right march. Is there any reason we shouldn't assume that all 150,000 people that went on the march support Tommy Robinson's views? Why is there a reluctance to talk about it being a racist rally or a far-right rally, do you think?
Yeah, look, I really share your annoyance, or I might even go further. I mean, I think it was pretty outrageous, and it's something that's been happening increasingly, and we saw it in the riots. How quickly did we see it in the riots last year, where all of a sudden it was all about legitimate anger? I think there's a vast difference between legitimate anger, which there is a lot of in British society. People are struggling under the cost of living, jobs, houses, hospitals, schools, their communities. They feel the sense of decline in their own family, their own community, in the country. Those things are all real and are causing legitimate anger. That doesn't legitimize standing in front of racist speeches and clapping, right? And there was a huge difference there. Now, of course, with 150,000 people, there will be various motivations for turning up at that event. But no one could have been at that event and heard the things coming through those speakers and decided to stand there without having some sympathy for far-right politics. There was nothing coming from that stage that was coded anymore. This was about, we are being replaced. This was well-known far-right rhetoric with well-known far-right figures who have been around for a long time, and they stood there and they clapped along. I think nowadays what we have to understand, and what the media is really struggling to get its head around, is to be far-right, you don't have to be in a far-right organisation. This is not the days of the National Front or the BNP, where the people you would say for far-right, they had a membership card, there was a leader, there was a branch structure. In the digital age, we have these post-organisational networks where thousands of individuals are engaging with and consuming far-right material, and in so many cases creating their own far-right material, engaging in far-right activism, but outside the confines of any traditional organisation. And so then when they're asked by the media, are you far-right? They say, no, of course I'm not. I'm not a member of anything. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the moment you're stood there clapping along to a speech where someone's calling for the banning of mosques, you're engaging in far-right activism, regardless of whether or not you're a member of any political party or any grouping. The far-right has changed nowadays, and I think the media is struggling to get its head around that.
That's a really interesting point, because I think there's a sort of standard way that the march was covered. First of all, any footage of people being violent or scuffles with the police, I get that. That's good. It's good TV. It's good. It's kind of good images, interesting. So there was a sort of element of the coverage that was, look at all these football hooligans fighting and causing trouble with the police. And then there were the kind of never-ending vox pops of people talking about reasons they'd come on the demo. Sky had someone who'd come because of the killing of Charlie Kirk. You had people spouting mostly inaccurate facts about sexual assault. But yeah, I think it's interesting, this idea that there isn't really, the media aren't really able to understand what's made people show up. And that is it's quite a different thing from watching a TikTok video to going on a demo outside a hotel that asylum seekers live in, or, coming to Waterloo and Whitehall to watch all of these speakers. What's changed? What's meant that Tommy Robinson can have 100,000 people in London when, a few years ago it was a fifth of that? Is it social media? Is it mainstream media? Is it a combination? What's different, and what's driving people to sort of come out on the streets?
One of the issues is when we're talking about the scale of this, for many people's minds, including obviously clear sections of the media, the far right is small, fringe, and extreme. And they're thinking about Nazis, etc. And so they walk through, the crowd on a day like that and go, you can't call this a far right demo. There's middle-aged women here with their children. And you turn around and say, but the definitions of far right was never based on gender or age. It was based on beliefs, right? And what it is that increasing numbers of people are ending up inculcated and believing far right politics. And that means that you're going to have a more diverse crowd of individuals. It's not just going to be skinheads in their early 20s, And the media is then struggling with that because a lot of the people at these protests don't necessarily fit the image of what they think is supposed to look like the far right. And that's really worrying, is because that's actually where we're seeing such large numbers being drawn into this politics. It's broadening out the demographics of the sorts of individuals that hold those beliefs. And then on the why is there so many more people? I think there's a number of reasons for it, right? But broadly speaking, is we talked last year, right, during the riots. We talked about this magma chamber of anger that was sat underneath British society, right? It was splurting out electorally with reform, with large Tommy Robinson type demonstrations, and then, of course, that horrifying period of far-right rioting, the worst in post-war British history. That magma chamber of anger under British society hasn't gone anywhere. People basically, it's a coalition of disaffected individuals who feel that their lives are getting worse, that they're what we call declinism. Both their lives, their communities are getting worse, their children's lives won't be better with them. And what the far right do is they then turn around and offer really simple solutions for that, which is ostensibly the politics of scapegoating. The difference these days is that now these individuals that are pushing this xenophobic, reactionary and kind of scapegoating politics have the possibility to reach tens of millions of people on social media. You might remember the outrage and uproar and discussions about when Nick Griffin, the leader of the British National Party, went on Question Time. This was a national discussion within our media about whether or not this was justifiable. Nowadays, it doesn't matter if you're on Question Time. Tommy Robinson can reach millions and millions of people on social media without any sort of editor or gatekeeper in place, which means that when people are disaffected and angry, many, as we say, for many of the right reasons, they're very likely, or it's very easy for them to come across content which explains it to them in a really simplified way, which gives them an enemy and takes that anger and directs it towards minoritized communities, to asylum seekers, to people of color, to the LGBT community, or to women in general. And that's this thing, I think, is a combination of high levels of anger with such ease of access to material that shapes that anger.
The thing that I think is most interesting to me is the starting point of high levels of anger, a sense that things aren't going well in the country, maybe, as you say, terminal decline. That isn't necessarily inherently a right-wing position. What makes someone more susceptible? Plenty of people that I follow are angry about the country and the world on social media platforms. So what makes someone more likely to end up in that right-wing filter bubble? And what are the, if we were sort of thinking about some of the factors that would lead you to end up on Tommy Robinson's channel, what drives people down the scapegoating route or makes them more susceptible to those messages?
Yeah, yes, being angry is definitely not a right-wing position, as you say. I'm really angry about all of those issues. You know what I mean? When I look at the state of things,
angry.
Yeah, and what we see in the communities that we work in, that, as we say, are susceptible to this politics, is almost a sense of desperation. It's not just that it's not just a general malaise that things aren't going very well. It's a sense of real desperation, and ostensibly, people have reached a level where they've concluded that the status quo is just not worked. It doesn't matter who they are. The status quo has worked time and time again, and there's been lots of change in that. It's not just the Conservative Party for years. It was the Labour Party for years. It was the Conservatives again for years. It's now the Labour Party again. And they're not seeing change. They're not seeing the material needs of their communities being met by politics. And it's got to the point where I think that there is a genuine sense of just absolute desperation in some areas and communities, right? And that makes them susceptible. But then we have to look at what the mainstream of our politics has been doing, which I think has been an important point. I often say that Tommy Robinson radicalizes some people, but the people that turn up at his demonstration already have prejudiced views about Muslims and immigrants and asylum seekers. And they're much more likely to have got that by reading our newspapers or even hearing our mainstream politicians talking in Parliament. I was thinking about when our Home Secretary talked about us being invaded. This was something that 10 years ago we would have only heard in the fringe of our politics, hearing it right in the centre. Or we hear about Donald Trump. We see his speeches that are extraordinarily extreme when it comes to a lot of these issues. And then we see him sitting next to the king on a state banquet just a few days later. And it's really hard to tell someone in one of these communities that the politics they're talking about is really extreme. And they say, but the president of America, these people are in power increasingly. They talk about themselves like they're plucky upstarts. But in many senses, this politics is now been so normalized within the centre of our things that you open a normal newspaper and you listen to our politicians in the mainstream speaking, and they're engaging in politics and using rhetoric which would have traditionally been far right. And so you've got this heady mix, and throw in that social media stuff we were talking about. So you've got anger, a sense the status quo isn't working, a normalization of xenophobic politics, and the access to more extreme versions of that politics on social media at the click of a button. And all of a sudden you're getting people dragged in much more quickly.
That's a really scary and really kind of clear, compelling picture. Yeah, I'm struck by, we're just this week, Donald Trump has yet again turned his fire on Sadiq Khan and, the Sharia law of London, which we're obviously both living under. But yeah, I think that's something that does feel very different and has shifted quite a lot, does seem to be the way that mainstream, Donald Trump, I think, is very much of the far right. But something that I found really infuriating and disappointing was having a government minister, a Labour politician, the Sunday after the Tommy Robinson rally, talking about free speech being alive and well and seeming reluctant to sort of call a spade and say this was a massive far right demo and we should all be really scared. Is there any evidence to suggest that Labour politicians, Social Democrats, capitulating to or sort of claiming that people that support Tommy Robinson have legitimate concerns. Like, is there any rationale for that? Because for me, it feels like just offering support for their argument. But like, is there any suggestion that it helps in any way?
No, God, of course, no, it doesn't help at all. I mean, look, the Labour Party is to blame for a huge amount of this, right? In many cases, the communities that we're talking about are communities that have been let down by the Labour Party over the last 50 years or so. And we saw the same when we looked at the rise of the British National Party. So the Labour Party is obviously involved in that. But, at times, after the riots, Keir Starmer surprised me slightly where he came out and made it really clear that it was the far right. And he said that because I wasn't sure that's the case. But look, if you look at this thing where social democratic parties like the Labour Party shift right on the issues of, say, immigration and identity to try and placate a vote to their far right, time and time again this has been tried, and it doesn't work, right? If you look at why people are voting for reform, for example, the data shows that it's a coalition of people with a range of views. The most their hardcore right, it is just about Islam, immigration, multiculturalism, right? Those people will never trust Keir Starmer about immigration and asylum seekers more than they trust Nigel Farage, no matter how far he pushes right. All he's serving to do by pushing right on the Labour Party on these issues is normalise a form of politics on which they are unlikely to lose. They're pushing the political narrative onto a pitch on which they are inherently less trusted, right? And all they do, so that just shifts the whole ground right, and it doesn't work. And we've seen social democratic parties try this time and time again over the last 20 years across Europe, where they try to outright the right, and it doesn't work. Rather than that is what we're seeing, this kind of doom spiral, right, where the people we're looking at here are actually talking about, it's really scary how big the numbers are, and they are getting bigger. But they remain a minority, right? They are extremely vocal minority. But what they're doing is they talk about themselves as the silent majority, but the silent majority is actually people that disagree with them, right? The data is really clear on that when you look at attitudes towards immigration, gender, so all these issues. The people that are on a Tommy Robinson demonstration may be growing, but they still remain a minority. But the media then whips up that thing and talks about them as the silent majority. And then our mainstream of our politics tries to placate that so-called silent majority, and everything shifts right and it doom spirals down, rather than saying, actually, how do we engage with the rest of society? Why don't we offer them a vision of change? Why don't we actually offer a progressive vision of change and tell them how we're going to make our lives better, while simultaneously dealing with the things that are making those communities angry by making material needs better for those places? But we're not seeing that. We're seeing a pandering that is only serving to normalise a politics that the Labour Party will lose on.
Yeah, and it just feels like if you agree with the problem, the way that people like Farage and Tommy Robinson set it out, the obvious answer to the problem is to vote for them, is to support them, is to back them. Yeah, it's just incredibly disappointing and infuriating. And, as a person of colour, as a Labour Party member, like upsetting to see people out on the streets, making the streets feel less safe, and then to have the sort of mainstream of politicians suggest that people have legitimate reasons to be protesting or to be part of far-right movements. And I think the other thing, for many of our listeners as well, is that it then makes you feel a bit like you're living in an alternate reality where things that, as you say, wouldn't have been acceptable in the mainstream, and things that are either dog whistles or overt call-outs for Britain to just be for white people, to just be for Christian people. Yeah, you can feel a little bit like you're living in another reality where what you're seeing is something completely different to what mainstream media commentators and politicians are seeing.
Yeah, and look, I mean, if look, everything you say, obviously, I agree with. And if you look at the data and the polling, the harder that the Labour Party have gone right on these issues, you haven't seen any vote shifting from reform back to the Labour Party. That's just not really happening. And I think that fear thing you mentioned is really important, right? And that's the thing that I think upsets me and people at Hope Not Hate the most, right? It's kind of why people get out of bed. I was in the north of Ireland last week and I met a group of black activist groups, and there's always been all sorts of problems like there is anywhere else. But they were talking about this rising fear, this sense of not sending their kids into town centres. And part of this is that I don't think necessarily, I think lots of people obviously always held racist views, of course, but they feel that they're now in the majority, or they feel they're confident that they're on the up. And so things that they probably thought and might have said to their friends, they're now shouting at people across the street. And that's just, it's the same with these the raising the flags all over the country. People can raise a flag for whatever reason they want, of course, but some people are raising it because they're marking territory. And they're turning around and saying, you're not welcome here. Who fits within that in-group? And invariably and often there's obviously huge racial elements to that. And it's just the normalization of this politics where all of a sudden the people that are racist, xenophobic, homophobic, misogynist feel emboldened to act on those things now. And that's scaring a huge amount of communities across the UK. And that's being normalised and emboldened by politicians in our mainstream, including the Labour Party. And that's what's so shameful about it.
What do you think is the rationale, though, for Labour politicians? I look at it and I think that there's, across the media and political class, because there's a disconnect between a lot of people that are likely to vote reform in the next election, whether that's on class, whether that's on the area of the UK that they're from, that there's like this pandering because there's so little representation of those communities in the political mainstream, because journalists are from such an elite, because leaders of the Labour Party are from such an elite, that there's this, and I think it comes through a lot in the coverage as well, this kind of a sort of classist, like there's, it's a lot of I guess for me, it just almost seems patronizing to be like, oh, well, these people are misinformed. They really care about this and they're saying that. Like one of the, I'll link to it, but one of the podcasts sort of almost like a reporter going out of his way to make people in a demo sound stupid, which for me is just perpetuating one of the reasons that people feel compelled by far right movements, which is that they don't feel accepted by the mainstream. And it feels like there's almost an othering of people that are susceptible to vote reform or support Tommy Robinson because our political elites are from such a kind of narrow pool now. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, it does. And I think it goes back to that thing, which is there's a huge difference between legitimate anger, which is fair enough and understandable, and the way that anger is being shaped and directed and articulated, which is completely unacceptable. And I'm not sure how, and sometimes I wonder both our political class and media class are excusing the latter when they mean to be excusing the former. But I agree, part of that is, I think, exactly what you say. The other bit is, I think, going out on a bit of a limb, is I think part of it is that they see these people on the streets for Tommy Robinson demonstration as just more rough and ready of versions of the politics that they have partly themselves. The concerns that are so legitimate they keep talking about are concerns that many of them themselves hold. And, so it's just that these people are a bit more... I think there's a class element to this. Of course there is. Farage's politics is not very different to Tommy Robinson's, right? In most of the politics is pretty similar, but one is more acceptable than the other. And then you can go one step further, and what you're hearing from the Conservative Party on the right of the Conservative Party isn't very different. So when they talk about legitimate concerns, in some cases I think it's because they're hearing those concerns around their dinner parties, right? And it's just that this is just a bit more rough and ready version of it. And so they're willing to appease that sort of thing because there's an empathy there. Not in all cases, of course, but in some cases. And then the last bit is, I think, is because of what they look like. A lot of the people that are involved in this politics now don't look like the far right in what their idea of the far right is. And so all of a sudden they're inherently more sympathetic to the individuals involved than they would be if you'd had 150,000 skinheads on there, where the Sun's front page would have been Nazi invasion. 150,000 people from different age groups and genders there, it's all of a sudden legitimate concerns,
Yeah, I'm struck by I won't link to it because it's terrible article, but someone who went along to the demo was like, there were women with cakes, and it was like, women with cakes? Nothing could be going wrong if there are women in cakes. Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. We are back from our summer break, and now that Gary is off writing his book, we're going to be playing around with the format of the show. So we're going to have more in-depth interviews, and we'll be having some exciting special guests who'll be coming on to co-host with me. Patreon subscribers were the first to know that the show was coming back. They had the chance to send in questions for Joe. If you like the podcast and you want us to keep going, please consider making a regular gift via Patreon today. Big shout out to Fenella, who became a Patreon subscriber over the summer, even though we weren't putting out any new episodes. This podcast isn't backed by a big media outlet or owned by a billionaire. We keep the lights on thanks to a few hundred people that each make a small contribution each month via Patreon. If you support us on Patreon, you'll get a weekly bonus episode, you'll be the first to know about live events, and you'll get access to the Over Under WhatsApp community. Go to patreon.com/overthetop_under-the-radar to support us today. There was a recent expose in The Observer that looked at the amount of money Tommy Robinson had from far-right American funders, Turning Point USA, fellowships, this idea that he's had support in getting his social media more slick. Is that something that's happening across the board? Is a lot of American money and influence pouring into the British far right? Or is this, again, this part of this long-standing tradition of fascists and far-right activists kind of talking to each other and sharing platforms?
You can kind of argue this one round, or you can argue it flat, right? There's no doubt there are examples, and some of them, of course, like the Shulman Fellowship and those sorts of things were mentioned in that article, or the Middle East Forum in North America's support for the Tommy, etc. These have been talked about for some years. And they have played a role. And it sounds also like Elon Musk, for example, was supposedly covering Tommy Robinson's legal fees for some of his recent court cases. So these things are important. But I sometimes fear that we almost take comfort in the idea that the far right is funded by some big organization somewhere else, or an awful businessman that's funding money into it, that's having this effect, when the really sad truth is that the vast majority of this activism is crowdsourced from across thousands of individuals that are donating £5, £10, etc. In this digital age, all of a sudden, when I talk about these post-organizational networks, they're like synapses that traverse the globe, that tactics shift between them, but also finances shift between them as well. There was some sponsors for the Unite the Kingdom rally. There was obviously Advance UK. There was some crypto companies, and there's all this sort of stuff in there. And that obviously plays a role in it. But he also asked for over £100,000 from his supporters. And I don't know, but there's a good chance he would have got it. Right. And so, I think it's one of those things where it's more comforting to think of it as though there was just one pot of money funneling this stuff in. In the digital age, most individuals can engage and organize now for nothing. You can set up your own website for pennies. You can then reach your supporters with digital, emails, social media apps. You can contact them on social media. Far-right activism now doesn't cost much money. Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't run a political party. You just have to pull in enough money through a Patreon to keep your bills paid, and you can be a full-time far-right activist now. And so it's not about saying there aren't dodgy figures with large pots of cash coming over, but it's actually more scary than that. It's low-level donations from a huge amount of people.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, we should say there's not full transparency into Tommy Robinson / Stephen Yaxley Lennon's fund. He doesn't, at the moment,
to say the least.
Yeah. We don't know how much money he's got. We know where he's coming from. He seems to live a nice life, but that we don't know, because he doesn't run currently a political party that has transparency and, regulated donations. But I think you're right. There's maybe it's a bit of a left-wing comfort blanket in the UK to be like, oh, it's all the big bad American donors and, it's all American money and these kind of sinister figures. And you're right. It makes it feel a little bit less scary than the idea that it is women with cakes or our neighbours.
But it's people that are in our trade unions, that it's people that live down our roads or in our communities giving a fiver. That's more scary than an American giving a pot of cash we don't know about,
The last time we spoke, we'd had a general election where Reform had a record number of votes, 4 million votes for, I think, what you would call a far-right party. Am I right? Yeah, populist radical right. Maybe I'll get you to define those in a minute. And since then, we've had local elections this year and now a record number of Reform councillors. What is Hope Not Hate doing about Reform, and how do you understand Reform in the context of the Tommy Robinsons and the people that are on the United Kingdom rally?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like this is going to be quite a depressing listen. People are sticking with it, but
we'll bring it back up at the end. We'll think of some jokes.
But from when we last spoke, right? We spoke not long after that last election, right? 14.1% of the vote, just over 4 million votes, as you say. What's really scary is that political party barely existed in the middle of last year when that election happened. They didn't have a branch structure. They didn't have really any members, etc. We're now monitoring nearly up to 500 branches by Reform across the country. There's over 7,000 members now, which makes it significantly larger than the Tory party. Up over 800 councillors now. If you think this May's elections, they now have 800. The year before, they won 2 seats. So we're seeing the speed of the growth on this, right? They're now the largest on 9 councils, a majority control 9 councils, largest on 4 others. So this is a really worryingly speed of trajectory. And of course, everyone knows they're now leading in the polls, in all polls, but significantly over the Labour Party. And while that's been happening, we're seeing them get more extreme. We saw Farage's deportation policies, which I think was up there with the most extreme things we've ever heard from a parliamentarian. Just recently, again, it goes even further, and it's talking about right to settlement for individuals that in some cases have been here for many, many years or even decades, etc. The Overton window is shifting he is shifting right. So it's really, really worrying. The good news is that people can no longer deny the danger of what's going on now. If something doesn't change, they will win control of Wales next year, the Senate elections. They will win a whole batch of other council elections next year. And if something doesn't change after that, then they're going to be the next government, right? And so we've got really clear targets here, which is, do you not want Farage to be the next prime minister of this country? And so what Hope Not Hate are doing is we're expanding. We've got a huge amount of campaigning going on. We've just done the largest ever poll in Britain to try and understand What is it that people in this country are believing? What is it that's driving this politics and this support for Farage? And trying to map the reform supporters and say, who are they? What do they believe? And in many cases, we've been doing this for a while. There's huge fault lines in this, and this is something the Labour Party need to understand. If you go up to the northeast of England, where I was campaigning in the last local elections against reform, those communities want more workers' rights. Well, we know Reform has voted against every workers' rights piece of legislation since they've been able to. They want more NHS funding, etc. They want nationalisation of industries. Right? These are things that Reform does not believe. So the political parties need to be talking about those issues rather than just talking about immigration, where they do agree with Reform, and trying to have those fault lines. We're going to be running campaigns, or we've already got organisers around the country. We're obviously focusing on Wales, of course, but other parts of the country as well for next year. We're building groups, we're getting activists in. And the idea is to have a really hyper-targeted, data-led campaign where for the next 4 years it'll be hugely social media, but it'll also be on the ground. And then the final bit of it is it's my team's job is to highlight the extremism that's there. If you go to our website, you will see story after story of individuals. Just last week we got someone kicked out of Reform because we identified them making a threat to assassinate Keir Starmer. So highlighting those things and trying to make sure that people that are in these communities or lots of places that are angry and upset don't see Reform as the right answer. And the final bit of it, sorry, going on, but the final bit here is they will not make things better, right? And we're seeing that. Look at the councils they already run. And this is a big bit of our work. How often do they actually turn up? Why aren't they, when they talk about these issues, why aren't they in the council meetings or the planning meetings where those issues are being discussed, right? They are incompetent. They are often extreme. And if you really are angry about these issues, it's our job at Hope Not Hate to explain to people that maybe you're right to be angry about loads of these issues, but Reform are not the people that are going to make that, fix those issues. And here's the weight of evidence to prove it,
When we're talking about people who might vote Reform UK, we're talking about a much bigger number of people. And we are talking about people who maybe most of the people that went on the Tommy Robinson demo will be voting Reform, but most Reform voters don't share Tommy Robinson's views. Is that fair? So we are talking about a different category of people. And Hope Not Hate have done lots of brilliant research that we'll link to about the sort of different subsets of Reform voters because there just are so many of them now. So is it fair to say that there is a disconnect between people who might vote Reform and people who went on the Tommy Robinson demo?
It's interesting, actually. I mean, Tommy Robinson's supporters now, because many of them affiliate more closely with Tommy Robinson, feel that he's been let down by Farage and Reform by not showing him support. And so they've actually gone into, or many of them will support Advance UK, which is run by Ben Habib, which was obviously formerly involved with Farage and the Brexit Party. So actually many of the people on that protest feel that Reform has let them down and aren't extreme enough. So a big chunk of them will hold their nose and vote Reform. There's no question. But
it's just a phrase I never thought I'd hear, hold your nose and vote Reform.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay.
But you're right, Reform 14.1% of the population, and obviously that number's going up. That's a really large number of people. It's a wide coalitions and it's a wide range of reasons that people are going into that. And it's taking people that have voted for all other political parties in the past and drawing them in, partly because it's populism. Populism at its core is this idea that there is the people and there is a corrupt elite, and the only people that can fix it are in this case, Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage is a very good operator in here, and he's pressing all of those sorts of buttons. But it is a coalition, and it's an unstable one. I'm not even sure they necessarily know who all these people are, let alone. And so I think there's huge fault lines in it, as I say, where we can turn around and exploit those. But so there will be crossover. It's almost like everyone who supports Tommy Robinson might consider voting for Reform, but not everyone who votes for Reform will like Tommy Robinson. But the key difference is style, not substance, I think. In many cases, there's a class element to this, and the language might be more extreme or more blunt, but ostensibly at its heart, Reform's politics and Tommy Robinson's politics are not a million miles away. There is a huge amount they agree on. It's much more about the way it's articulated rather than there being... And Farage, it's useful. For Farage, he wants the mainstream to vote for him, so he says, I'm not like Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson's too extreme. And he's happy to lose some of his supporter base to Tommy Robinson if it means that he can get more of the Tory voters who are slightly nervous about him at the moment.
So there's a sort of respectability politics at play that sanitises Reform, even though when push comes to shove, the politics aren't that different. Your team and other Hope Not Hate people are kind of lurking on the social media profiles of Reform people. You're outsourcing it to supporters. So it sounds like that, in a sense, the solution to the problem is to use the tools that the far right are using, but to take them down. Is that like a fair analysis? Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, one of the things I actually take hope from is all of the things we moan about in the digital age that the far right are using to push divisive, polarizing, xenophobic politics. Most of it's free and available to us to push a different type of politics, I should add. And so in the same way that it's really scary how cheap and easy it is for them to organize, it can be the same for us, the ability and the tools that are out there. So that's something hopeful in that. And also I think now is that people are scared, right? And that's awful to hear all the time. But people are scared and want to do something about that. And organizations like Hope Not Hate, but not just us, there's lots of other people campaigning on all sorts of issues related to reform as well, is people are getting active. And it's about making sure we get active in the most effective way and have the best impact we can.
I mean, it's a scary amount of time ago now, since 2010. And maybe some people listening will have been part of that Hope Not Hate mobilisation embarking in Dagenham to stop the BNP from winning and getting into Parliament. Is that what it's going to take this time? People turning up to leaflet, to phone bank, to door knock? Is that what we need to do in all the elections to come before the next general election?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, Barking and Dagenham was the largest anti-fascist mobilisation, I think, probably in British history, not just by Hope Not Hate, but a whole range of other groups. And we're going to need that, but we're going to need that in lots of communities this time around. The scale is going to have to be much larger. We're going to have to be fighting all over the country in loads of places, not just, in Dagenham, Burnley and Stoke were the big ones in 2010, all those campaigning elsewhere, but those are the big ones. We're going to need lots of big ones this time around. But I think there is lots of people out there. There's more people out there that see this as a threat than would have seen the BNP as a threat, because it's touching their communities in a way that the BNP was more concentrated in certain areas. And so it's about having lots of that, as you say, knocking on doors, delivering leaflets, phone banking, of course, but also social media. That's an arena where this battle is going to be fought as well. And Hope Not Hate is going to be doing lots of hyper-targeted content. But a lot of that's also going to be actually, how do we get this community, this information out? How are we speaking to our neighbours? Let's speak to go down the local football club. And if you feel safe, have those conversations there. Who are the right messengers we need to be getting on board now that are in trusted positions to have these conversations? It's going to be massive, right? But if we do it right, it's going to be the most successful and most engaging and most important anti-far right campaign that's ever happened in this country, But it needs to start right now, because it's 4 years at the end, and Wales next year is going to be a real battleground.
And I mean, we've talked a lot about things that could make us feel pessimistic or downtrodden, but I mean, we do have a proud history of anti-fascist mobilisations in the UK. You've got a PhD in fascist movements or kind of British fascist history. I'm not getting it right. We do also have a tradition of communities organising and standing up to fascism and the far right in all of its forms. I guess in a sense, it's like taking up the baton from people that have come before, whether that's Cable Street or people who turned out in 2010. I mean, it's definitely something that's in our history, right?
Yeah, look, we've won before and we're going to win again. It's just it's whether or not we win again next year, or if we win again after the next election, or if it's going to have to be the election after that, right? This is a battle that doesn't go away. I always say about the far right, look, if unfortunately, if fascism survived after the revelation of the gas chambers, then this is not something that is ever completely destroyed or beaten. It's always going to be there. It's a continual struggle and a continual fight. But every time it's happened in the past, we've beat it, right? And so this won't be any different. It's just about how quickly we can do it. And the good news, I think, that I take a lot of hope in, not just here, or Trump's America, or previously Bolsonaro's Brazil, or Vox and Chega in the Iberian Peninsula, or the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, or Le Pen in France, or the AfD in Germany, or Brothers of Italy in Italy, or Fidesz in Hungary, or Law and Justice in Poland, or Modi in India. You could go on and on and on, where we've got real problems with the far right. Not in any of those places have the far right been a majority, right? They remain a minority, and obviously electoral systems, etc. But the good news and the really hopeful bit of that is that the only way we don't win this is if we don't collaborate, if we don't come together and we don't fight. But if we do those things and we are a majority, and we're going to need popular fronts, we're going to have to forge uncomfortable alliances across our politics here to beat a party like Reform. And that's going to be difficult, but like, we're going to happen. But if we do those things and we come together, then we'll win. And so it still remains in our hand. This isn't that they are 60% of the population agree with what they agree with and we're on the back foot. the majority actually agree with politics that is opposed to that form of politics. So it's in our hands. We just have to come together and win.
I think you've said it before. I mean, and I think that is the heart of all of it. This is still a vocal minority. They are emboldened. They are vocal. They are getting more mainstream attention than ever before. And, you know, they've got Patreon accounts, but we are still talking about a minority. And I guess, and that, I mean, the PhD came through there, all around the world, there is cause for hope. So I think that's like a nice note to kind of come to the end on, and a plug for Hope Not Hate's work, but also for other organisations. I like the idea of uncomfortable alliances and working across political parties. I mean, I think the other thing to say is that we always have better snacks and we always have better music than the fascists. So.
If I didn't mention that, I'd be shameless here. I wrote a book about the role of music in resistance movements, and the paperback came out yesterday. So it's only £10. But yeah, it's about, and I agree, we always have better music, and that is one of the great advantages.
Thanks a lot, Joe. You've been brilliant as ever. And just thanks for all the great work you do. You can buy Joe's book. We'll link to it in the show notes and the newsletter. And you can support Hope Not Hate by just joining their email list or following them on social media.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.